Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. Welcome to the first installment of 3GNY's new series, Jewishness, Activism, and Belonging, the Post-Holocaust Diaspora, and Intersections with Marginalized Communities. The goal of the series is to highlight the diverse intersections of being Jewish and being descendants of the Holocaust in the modern post-World War II era. My name is Marione Ingram, and I'm a proud 3G. I'm a grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, my beautiful grandma Lily, who is 95 and my inspiration. Before we dive into tonight's program, I'd like to share a little bit about 3GNY for those who may not be familiar. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and supporters and allies. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for descendants of survivors. I've been involved with 3GNY for many years, and my grandmother has shared her own story of surviving Auschwitz with the community. And speaking of sharing stories, 3GNY has a fantastic 3G speaker training program called We Do, which stands for We Educate. In this 4-week program, grandchildren of survivors learn how to organize and compellingly share their family stories in school classrooms and with companies and community groups. This impactful work would not be possible without the support of our community. A gift to 3GNY of any amount would be very appreciated. I'm going to post a link in the chat for you to donate. Thank you so much. We'll be sending more information about 3GNY and We Do in a follow-up email after the event. So back to tonight. February is Black History Month, and I'm so proud to have planned this program to be adjacent to the celebration. Tonight's moderator, my very good friend and colleague, Gyasi Barber, will be interviewing Marione Ingram, who was a Holocaust survivor and civil rights activist. Born in Hamburg in the 1930s, Marione survived the Holocaust and the Hamburg Bombing in Nazi Germany, only to find that when she came to the US, racism was as pervasive in the American South as antisemitism was in Europe. In her words, joining the civil rights efforts with her beloved husband and son in tow, no less. as a survivor was, to quote Marion, liberating and empowering. Today's event is an important discussion about shared activism and social justice between the Jewish and Black communities. Perhaps we have more in common than we initially imagined, especially in the face of isms like racism, antisemitism, the list goes on. Questions for Marion can be submitted via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will leave about 10-15 minutes for audience questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce Gyasi, who will share a few words to kick off the discussion with Marion.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. As you may very well know, today, as Lauren mentioned, is the last day of Black History Month. I am very happy to celebrate the intersection of two of my identities, being the son of a Black man and a Jewish woman from New York, in a conversation with Marione Ingram, who is, as Lauren mentioned, a Holocaust survivor, a civil rights activist, and author of two books, The Hands of War and The Hands of Peace. I had the pleasure of chatting with Marione last week after reading The Hands of Peace, and several things stood out to me. One, her zeal in her storytelling was infectious. Two, her level of knowledge was truly inspiring, as I am one who is driven to learn a lot about history. And finally, her ability to say things that need to be said and that others will not say gave me a true embodiment of the late John Lewis. Although Marion is a Holocaust refugee and survivor, she describes herself more so as an activist for all people who need it. Her belief that all human beings should be equal is as strong today as it was when she was a child. I hope that you all get out of this as much as I know you could. A reminder that we'll have time for questions at the end. In the meantime, join me in welcoming Marione Ingram. Oh, Marion, you're on mute. Isn't that just the story of Zoom?
Mute. Okay.
There we go. There we go.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me, Gyasi, Lauren, and everyone else. It's a pleasure to share our common desires to make the world a better place for everyone. And it is something that I believe we are able to do if we stick together. I'm going to make a prepared statement, if you don't mind, which sort of tells a little bit about myself. I have learned this past summer, last year, I talk a lot in different countries, in Japan, in Germany, and wherever people want me to talk to them. And in Germany, I learned that I am the last living survivor of the Hamburg bombing, the worst bombing of the Second World War in Europe, of the biggest and worst firestorm ever. The world has never seen anything like it. Entirely man-made firestorm, and the Holocaust. I am now the last living survivor, a fairly awesome and almost creepy distinction to be the last of anything. And so I haven't yet quite figured out how to bear this responsibility, being the last one. I'm still working on it. I will be going back to Europe, and I hope that I will get over this feeling of being overwhelmed by such a thing. Anyway, the last 6 years of life in America have been much too reminiscent of my first 6 years in Nazi Germany. During both periods, a madman ruled and incited millions to reject democracy and embrace autocracy. Both men also demonized immigrants and ethnic groups and encouraged violence and narcissistic nationalism. I began to experience PTSD weeks before America gave almost unlimited power to a man who actually lost the presidential election by 3 million votes. Walking beside the Potomac River, I told Daniel, my beloved companion, that I could hear my parents talking in the 1930s as they walked beside the river that runs through Hamburg, Germany. They were saying, this can't be happening. We are too smart for this. He won't last. He will be defeated and things will return to normal. I was a child then and didn't understand the politics, but I felt the fears and the tension. And again, besides the Potomac in 2016. Today, as every sensible person now knows, my parents were spectacularly wrong about Germans rejecting Hitler, and America's so-called founding fathers were equally wrong when they created the Electoral College. As you may know, almost 25% of Americans are uninformed about the Holocaust, and I doubt that more than a tiny percentage of people of any age are aware that many of the Third Reich's racist laws, the so-called Nuremberg laws, were based on US laws that successfully subjugated African Americans. The Nazis actually sent a group of lawyers to America to learn how a respected republic could get by with in-your-face oppression of a minority group. According to my mother, one new Nazi rule prohibited doctors from helping a newborn Jewish baby to breathe. She told me I desperately needed such help, and a doctor at the Jewish hospital in Hamburg risked his life to give me a life. By the time I was 5 years old, Germany had been allowed to kill thousands of Jews and annex other lands with impunity. Encouraged by such, quote, successes, Germany's mad leader had invaded several nations on one pretext or another and was engaged rather openly in genocide. On the day before my 6th birthday, my beloved grandmother, Rosa Singer, was ripped from my arms and deported with more than 1,000 other Hamburg Jews to a killing site in Minsk, Russia. 10 days earlier, my uncle Hans, her son who taught me to read, was taken from our arms and sent with my Aunt Emma, her entire family, and more than 1,000 other Jews to the same killing site. There, they were made to undress and kneel beside a large ditch, and then they were shot. Those who didn't fall into the ditch were kicked or pushed, dead or alive, into that ditch. My grandmother was staying in my mother's apartment when they came for her. I kicked the shin of the policeman who pulled me away from her, and he picked me up by my throat and began to squeeze harder and harder. Finally, his commanding officer ordered him to put me down. I think this is probably an additional reason I am so incensed by chokeholds. The next day's newspaper proudly announced that the Nazis had made good on their promise to, quote, rid the city of its Jews. The US was still at peace with Germany at the time these genocide crimes were committed, but it pretended not to notice. There is a wonderful film that talks exactly about America's reaction called The Holocaust in America. And I recommend that you watch it. It details how America evaded helping Jews. It was a PBS experience, one of their American Experience series. I learned last summer from German historians that my grandmother was supposed to have been deported 10 days earlier, but my mother had hidden her in our apartment. Apparently, a neighbor informed on her. After successfully murdering more than 1 million Jews without paying any price, the Nazis decided to install gas chambers in several concentration camps, such as Auschwitz, which were easily identifiable as death camps because of the elaborate rail network that connected them and the tall crematorium chimneys that sent smoke and human ash high into the sky, day and night. Because my father was not a Jew, and because he and my mother were married before the Nuremberg laws, the Nazis didn't order her deportation to a concentration camp until the summer of 1943. By that time, my middle sister Helga, who was blonde and fair, had been placed with a non-Jewish couple, the Pimbers, who lived on the outskirts of Hamburg and were part of my father's anti-fascist underground group. Without telling me about the deportation order, my mother sent me with my baby sister Rena to stay with non-Jewish relatives, and then attempted to take her own life, desperately hoping that this would save her children. But I turned around halfway there and returned to our apartment. I found my mother was unconscious with her head inside the gas oven. I pulled her out, turned off the gas, opened windows, and waited. And after many desperate hours, she revived. This was the worst and longest night of my life. The next day, my father's cousin Inge arrived, concerned because a Jew living in her building had committed suicide after receiving the same deportation order. She took my sister Rena home with her, and the next night the Allies launched what they called Operation Gomorrah. 10 days and 10 nights of bombing Hamburg civilians, sometimes with more than 1,000 bombers. In just one 4-hour period, they killed almost 60,000 civilians, most of them women and children. This was, quote, the deadliest single bombing raid in Europe in World War II. And it created, quote, the greatest man-made firestorm the world has ever seen. My mother and I were bombed out at ground zero and were not allowed in a bomb shelter or even a church basement. We spent 10 days and nights in flaming and exploding streets, often picking our way around charred bodies. When Operation Gomorrah ended, the Nazis naturally assumed we were among the many dead women and children so badly burned that they couldn't be identified. This enabled my father to arrange for us to hide with the Pimbers, who didn't much like Jews, but loved Helga. Sometimes my mother and I had to hide in an earthen dugout, literally underground, and other times in a garden shack. While we were hiding, my father was imprisoned by the Gestapo for helping Belgian Jews avoid being deported to death camps. Eventually released to fight on the Russian front, he refused to fire his weapon at the Russians. I didn't learn about that refusal or the reason for his imprisonment until long after his death. I thought he had been caught doing other underground activities, which are described in my book, The Hands of War. But I knew his steadfast and often dangerously unlawful support was the reason my mother and I and my two sisters survived, while some 40 Jewish relatives and in-laws perished. There's a wedding photo in the book Hands of War of that family, and only 3 of that group survived. My father and his 6 brothers fiercely resisted the Nazis. And years after he died, I learned from a publication by a German historian that the reason for his imprisonment was that he had been caught helping Belgian Jews escape. What a wonderful legacy. He had 4 brothers who also resisted and died under interrogation by the SS for helping the French. And when father was sent from prison to Russia and front, he refused to fire his weapon. After the war, most Germans were still hostile to Jews and only regretted the hardship of defeat. I and my younger sisters attended a Zionist school for Jewish children with incredible survival stories. But except for us, without parents or home or country, so they were sent to Palestine, usually illegally. Some of their stories are in the hands of war, and some are still friends. Although many fought in one or more of Israel's wars, they pursue peace with Palestinians because, to quote them, we know what it is like to be stateless refugees. After the Zionist school closed, I attended a German school in which I was the only Jew and was persecuted by the teacher, former Nazis, and severely harassed by my classmates. I wanted to quit, but my father insisted that I stay and stand up for the millions of Jewish children who had been murdered. 2 years ago, after speaking to a German group, I was told by a member of the audience that she attended the same school with my sister Helga, and that Helga had been so abused by teachers and students that she refused to answer any personal questions and always responded to anything asked of her with, "I don't know." In 1952, I came to America on a student visa to study psychology and develop as an artist. On my own in New York, no one seemed to care whether I was a Jew or whatever. And I felt free for the first time. But I soon realized that African Americans and Puerto Ricans were ghettoized and treated much the same way Jews were in Europe before the Holocaust. My first protest was to resign an internship at an advertising agency when I learned that a better educated Black woman could only work there as a cleaner of the ladies' room. I was always struck when I tried to talk to people about this racism, which really struck me in the most powerful way, because I believed all of the propaganda that America sent about being the land of the free and what have, you know, that usual litany of lies in a way. And whenever I asked people about, how can you live with that without, going crazy, without doing something about it, they said, oh, it's the Southerners, the dumb Southerners who do this. And I said, but, we are in Manhattan, in New York, and it's happening. Anyway, so my introduction to America, where I was both free and not free. When I met Daniel, I was working at the Museum of Modern Art, surrounded by great art and aspiring artists, and he was a writer-editor for a major publisher. We were both happier than we had ever been, but I was experiencing PTSD, often triggered by street sounds of alarm or merely talk of war on the evening news. Disturbing dreams frequently interrupted my nights, and I began to write about my experience as a form of therapy. In 1957, Daniel gave me a dictionary as a birthday present to help me write in English. And I wrote every day at a table reserved by the owner, Hilda, at Cafe Reggio on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village. And today, I still write every day, and I still have that dictionary, albeit quite tattered. But when I tried to write about Operation Gomorrah, I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried, until one night, lying and sometimes crying in Daniel's arms, I experienced total recall, down to the color of the panties I was wearing when a bomb struck our building. In the next days, I wrote down what I had remembered, and it helped a bit as therapy. But when Daniel got a much better job in Washington, D.C., and we moved there in 1960, we saw that overt racism infected almost every aspect of life in the nation's capital, where residents weren't allowed to vote. We joined the Congress of Racial Equality and began to protest racism in housing, employment, healthcare, education, recreation, justice, welfare, etc., etc. The Hands of Peace describes 2 police brutality cases that illustrate the tangled web of structural changes needed for real reform. In 1963, I was a volunteer worker for the March on Washington. The Washington Post, which had no Black reporters or editors at the time, was a big problem because it repeatedly highlighted the possibility of violence. As the world knows, that march was a giant Gandhian step forward and led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That year, I coordinated Washington's participation in a 4-day-and-night vigil on the boardwalk at Atlantic City to support the seating of the Mississippi Freedom Party delegates at the Democratic National Convention. We didn't win that fight, but we ended racial exclusion in such conventions for all times, I hope. At the urging of civil rights heroine Fannie Lou Hamer, I went to Mississippi a week later to work as a staff member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. My jobs were to run a freedom school and help Black citizens to register to vote. The murders of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were still at large when the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross in front of my school. I painted freedom on the charred cross. Here you go. and they came to get me. Fortunately, the student told her parents that I was in trouble, and a rescue party arrived first. Despite the murders and KKK terror, we were able to demonstrate through the Democratic Freedom Party that African Americans would vote in large numbers if given the chance. After the election, I was arrested, however, and had to leave the state or go to prison for 280 days. Months later, we were forced to leave our rented house in Chevy Chase, Maryland, because neighbors were incensed that we were helping a Black family find a home in that area. When they threatened to kill our 3-year-old child, we moved back into DC's inner city. In 1965, the brutality inflicted on African Americans protesting the denial of voting rights in Selma, Alabama, re-energized the rights movement and inspired President Johnson to get Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act. This proved to be a high watermark for the civil rights movement and has continued to inspire African Americans to vote, even though the Supreme Court stopped enforcing the act. And as you know, voter suppression has gotten much worse since then, to the point where it threatens to destroy American democracy. In the meantime, however, the civil rights movement had opened the gates for the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the phenomenal gay rights movement. And in 1984, in one of the most wildly successful protests ever, 6 of us began picketing the South African embassy. After a time, we had many more protesters because civil rights leader Marion Barry, who was DC's mayor, and my co-worker in SNCC, by the way, and word spread to politicians and celebrities that you can get harmlessly arrested in a noble cause. Congress overrode President Reagan's vetoes and imposed sanctions on South Africa. Other countries did the same, and suddenly Nelson Mandela was free at last, and South Africa abandoned apartheid. It's still a troubled land, alas. There's a lot more civil rights history to learn from, including Germany's decision to examine its history and embrace empathy, which has transformed it from worst offender to best example. And while people of the same nationality, faith, and color have continued to slaughter one another, we now have scientific proof that race is a myth, that as Hawkins and Tysons have taught us, we are all made of stardust and belong to the same human family which began in Africa. We also know that women and men are equally capable of fantastic achievement if they have equal education and opportunity. The most important lesson I learned from the Holocaust was to oppose oppression wherever and whenever I find it. I learned that from my father's example and from what I experienced during the Holocaust and afterwards in the civil rights movement. Believe me, it is better to stand with the oppressed than to look the other way. But it is also true that the future we face now is more threatening than the one I faced as a child. Solar and nuclear annihilation were not in the picture then. and the emerging so-called Cold War was offset somewhat by the realization that international cooperation was needed to keep the wicked from blowing up the world. The trouble is, savage religious combat, high-tech economic warfare, and a surge in authoritarian nationalism have just about overwhelmed internationalism. The loss of millions of lives because of the chaotic response to COVID-19 illustrates how far we have regressed. Already, catastrophic climate change is close to the point of no return, and thousands of nuclear weapons are in, to put it mildly, very unstable hands. And to add to these problems, we have just experienced a violent and broadly supported attempt to overturn a presidential election, followed by hundreds of new legislative attempts to suppress voting by people of color. Because of my experience of Nazi fascism as a child, I tried to warn as many people as I could of what was coming. I spoke to individuals and groups, and sometimes to the consternations of the officials who invited me. I even lectured the top brass at the NSA. And during the first 4 months after the election, we went every day to the White House with signs saying, resist fascism, reject Trumpism. The American press, which now speaks about the growing fascism, pointedly ignored us. The foreign press frequently interviewed us, including at the Israeli embassy when we protested snipers shooting Gazan kids, flying kites with homemade Molotov cocktails somehow attached on their tails. And as you are aware, conditions here and elsewhere became progressively undemocratic, all the way up to the violent attempt on January 6 to overturn a national election and murder key officials who stood in the way. Even worse, this attempted coup, organized and orchestrated by the former president, was supported and is still supported by a majority of Republican congressmen who voted to overturn the election. And hundreds of state laws have since been enacted to suppress voting rights and enable state legislature to overturn results. The situation today tells us that it is possible for a great nation with an educated population to change quickly from a democracy to an autocracy. And after a life of activism, I still do what I can. But you and your cohorts around the world are the ones who are going to have to deal with the complex existential threats that confront civilization. Fortunately, you have fantastic new means of communication with one another to organize and work together to overcome non-violently, always non-violently.
Wow, Marion. Thank you so much for sharing that. My brain was just going off on lots of different things. 2013, the end of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, but you know, we have a limited amount of time. We actually have a lot of questions that came through the Q&A, so we're gonna get to questions that we've prepared, and then we'll go to the Q&A in the last 10 to 15 minutes. I think the first question really, and you talked about it a little bit in your prepared statement. You know, when you think about civil rights activism today, how would you compare it to the civil rights movement of the 50s into the 60s? You know, what are the pressing issues of today as compared to back then?
The issues then are on the same issues today. We have not, unfortunately, there was a moment when we thought, we had at least part of this solved. But then when Reagan came along, he unsolved that. Added to these issues now are climate. We are now confronted with a war in Europe, where Russia is going, killing Ukrainians. And so the issues today are in some ways even bigger because they are more global. They are not, and the racism in this country continues, unabated. To that, we have now added other issues. So it is, I think, one thing that is changed is that people of goodwill and good intentions sometimes act out in ways that are not beneficial in achieving a goal. You can't go creating violent confrontations. It will not solve your problems. It will just harden the opposition. So I think that activism has to continue, and it always has to deal with what is at hand in the time in which you live. We had the civil rights movement that dealt with the oppression of Blacks and the inability for Blacks to vote, that morphed into women, and it morphed into gay rights, and it morphed into other, and now we have added more things to it. We have, the essential questions of, closing borders to people who are starving and in need of shelter, and we refuse to shelter them despite the fact that we have a big country. So, as I said, it is changed because we believed so strongly in nonviolence. Unfortunately, Stokely was helping to change it, because with Stokely, the nonviolence was eliminated from student nonviolent coordinating committee, which saddened me a great deal.
Definitely. And you touched on this a little bit. There's obviously clearly a common thread between being anti-racist, being against anti-Semitism,
all connected,
sexism, LGBTQ plus rights, immigration. So what's the, and you really need to, as you mentioned, you need to be an ally. If you're going to be an activist, you have to be an ally for all marginalized communities. But what's the best way? What's the best way to do that, in your opinion?
I don't have a magic wand, but one of them is, of course, you deal with your representatives by bombarding them with letters and phone calls and visits to the office. We are unrepresented in Washington, and because Washington will have 2 Democratic votes, they will not let us have our statehood. So we are, in effect, occupied place by Republicans, and who decide all the time that if we enact anti-gun laws, and passed a law that no guns. Washington will be gun-free. You cannot buy them, you cannot bring them. And they say, no, you can't do it. We decided that poor women were going to be helped in reproductive rights and other health care issues, passed that law. With our taxes, all of this with Washington taxes, we are one of the most highly taxed states. And Congress said, can't do it. Guns in in Washington, you know, you have to have guns. You can't allow poor women to have access to reproductive health care. So I think that my personal and Daniel's personal activism includes all. We make no distinction. To me, as we are all human beings, and all human beings have fundamental needs and ideally fundamental rights, but so many people don't have not even the basic rights. There are people who don't even have the right to eat because, you know, we allow people to starve. So I say that obviously, you know, doing things like taking picket signs to demonstrations, or to be in touch with other people in other parts of the world who are also fighting for whatever, and especially since young people especially are so connected with their cell phones that they can just easily, you know, connect with other people, so that their shared goals and aims and methods of achieving things are at hand. But for Americans to achieve something for America and for America's problem is Congress. You know, you go to your congressman, you know, to all local meetings, you know, when your congressman wants your vote, you say, yes, I'll give you my vote. What are you going to do about feeding poor people? What are you going to do about education? What are you going to be doing about, you know, and you name the list, you know, the things that most interest you. The last, in a lecture last week at Columbia University, you know, I asked the students, you know, what issue would you pursue if you were only to focus on one thing? And so they named different things, you know, reproductive rights was high when they were women, but they were other, you know, depending on their interest. And so I think you have to choose what interests you most, what, you know, and use how you're good at something to further that. But to me, the best thing is to go to congressmen. We do this, but most of the time they won't let us in because we don't have our representation. So Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was also part of the civil rights movement, and SNCC, you know, she was a colleague, so that she is, you know, on the side of the angels, so to speak. So it is that, and our problems now are really so global that our solutions have to be global as well, you know, so that we can't just decide it has to be here. So I think Congress, vote these awful people out. You know, just vote them out. Don't let them get another term. In November, we have to be so strong. And I would suggest that we follow the playbook of the 60s student movement and go to states where they want to prevent people from voting. And definitely, you know, talk to Congress people.
Thank you, Marion. We have about 10 minutes left of our event. So we're going to go over to submitted questions from some of our guests. We have a lot of great questions in here. The first question is from Megan, and I'll read it out. Some people feel that comparisons between the Holocaust and present day politics shouldn't be made. From what you've said, it seems like you disagree with this. I'd love to hear more from you about this and how you respond to that.
I'm not suggesting comparisons. What I'm suggesting is lessons. We need to learn lessons. We are banning books in schools. The Nazis burned books. They burned art because they it, disagreed with their sense of whatever. And we are doing the same thing. We are now condemning generations to being uneducated in their history. So it's not a comparison, it's a lesson. To me, it's a lesson that we haven't learned and that we resist in learning. So I hope that answers Megan's question.
Agreed. I love that. I love that question and great answer. The next question is from Joseph. Martin Luther King said that one should be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Based on this, do you feel that we must try to fill a position of employment based on ethnicity or based on qualifications? And I know you like answering these types of questions, so I wanted to read it out.
That one is really hard. So I think that we have to take into consideration people who have been denied employment because of the color of their skin or their religious belief or whatever. That has to be taken into consideration. And I think qualifications always matter. You're not going to employ somebody who's not qualified, although they do it all the time. White people are employed and are not as qualified as some other ethnic person, whatever, whether it is a Muslim or Black or Jewish. My mother was fired at Allstate Insurance Company when it was discovered that she was Jewish. So it didn't matter, qualifications. She was Jewish, so fired, from one minute to the next. So I think that that's difficult. I would scale it on, you have to give people a chance. And the only way you are going to give people a chance if you employ them, if you allow them into schools. And sometimes you have to weigh in favor of one thing over another. So if I were an employer, I would take ethnicity into consideration at a very high level. And even if that ethnic person may be a little less qualified, let's say, that is because that person has been so discriminated against in, educationally and in housing and in every way possible. So you give the person a chance, you give people, and so you allow this person to be employed. And if then that person doesn't work out, then you try to help, you do something. This is how I would deal with it.
Yep, there are plenty of people that are not good at their jobs.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough question, and you have to acknowledge systems that have kept people out of places to get employment.
So I say you give people who've been left out a chance to be brought in.
Agreed. Great. The next question is also from Joseph. So I'm going to change it around a little bit so that it's more of a communicative question. So at the Holocaust Museum in New York City, at the Auschwitz exhibit, there's a recording and video that shows African Germans speaking perfect German. I guess, one, were you aware of African Germans? And, I guess, do you feel like there should be more knowledge of those people?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. American soldiers, Black American soldiers have left countless Black babies behind. And very unfortunate. And then those babies grew up, being vilified, although it, was not their fault. So it is men behaving irresponsibly, and women allowing them to be, letting them do it. Although the women at the time did this for food. and often out of need. So that's difficult. Yes, there was during the Hamburg bombing and the Holocaust, there was a rather famous, now famous Black youth, much older than I, who didn't go to concentration camp because he was not a Jew, so they made distinctions. So if you were Black, you were able to survive, but if you were a Jew, it was curtains. So it's, yes, I'm aware of, there are now a lot of Black, I don't know what you mean by a lot, but there are Black Germans.
Yeah, there's Black people everywhere. I can confirm that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marion. The next question we have is from Emily. And this is something that you wanted to talk through a little bit. How does your identity as a survivor play into your work advocating for Palestinian human rights?
I am.
I think it's more like your identity as an activist than your identity as a survivor. But
yeah, to me, it's unthinkable that Israelis treat their neighbors the way they do. Not just me as an activist, Marion, but a human being. My humanity disallows treatment of Palestinians, and it is shocking to me and a bitter pill for me that Jews in Israel are doing what they're doing, which is, and this goes to the question before about making comparisons. But here, these are people who are descended, from direct discrimination, direct murder because of their Jewishness. And they're doing things to Palestinians which are gruesome.
You can tell that the two men we met on the beach.
Yeah, and we had spent quite some time in Israel and lived in the Arab section of Jerusalem, right in front of the Damascus Gate. And Jews were telling us, oh, you can't live there and you can't live in the Arab section. And oh, you can't go in the Damascus Gate. And the night before we left, and we left from Tel Aviv, two young men came up to us and said, are you Americans? And I said, yes. And they went on a tirade about Obama. And so I asked, why are you here? And, sort of answered, responded to this stupid tirade against Obama, which we are so used to in Washington, because after his election, it was just horrific. Anyway, so I said, why are you here? And they said that they're in Israel because they're going to join the army because they want to, so that they can kill Palestinians. And I took my breath away and I said, how would you feel if Palestinians were coming and saying, I'm going to join the army so I could kill Jews? So this to me is one of the crimes of the century, is what's happening and it has nothing to do with my being an activist. It has just something to do with my being a human being, being on the side of other human beings. And when we were in Israel, I talked about it all the time. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to travel in Israel and see these walls. Yeah, and I was in Beirut, Lebanon, when the Israelis murdered the refugees in Shatila. And so it's, Israel's behavior is unpardonable. And the fact that America supports Israel is deplorable. I'm so saddened. I'm saddened beyond words.
So we're about at time. I want to thank you for your time. I'm going to kick it back to Lauren, but I'm going to speak one last, not a question, but a statement from Carol. You are an amazing lady and very inspiring, and I am so very happy to have met you virtually today. Thank you for sharing. I hope many younger people are inspired to carry on your ideals and work against voter suppression and racism. Thank you for your most wonderful actions and words. And I can confirm that at least one young person is going to carry on your work. And I'll kick it back over to Lauren, and it's been a true honor and pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. I know some of these topics can be kind of intense to talk about, but Marione is someone with opinions that wants to share. So thank you all, and we can take a deep breath. We're all a community. We all support each other. So thank you for tuning in for the first installment of Jewishness, Activism, and Belonging. Please stay tuned for our upcoming events in May and June. Marione, thank you. You are an inspiration. Thank you for sharing your story with us tonight. It's been such a pleasure collaborating with you over the last few months. Also, Gyasi, thank you for being a fantastic co-pilot. It's been so great working with you. And lastly, he's on the line, but Dave Reckes is the Executive Director of Free GNY. Thank you for being an amazing sounding board and partner on this as well. Lastly, please consider making a donation to 3GNY to continue this type of work and our work sharing Holocaust stories such as Marione's in school. Also, in the spirit of intersectionality, please consider subscribing to the Anti-Racism Daily to continue being an ally to the Black community. And last but not least, please consider purchasing Marione's books, The Hands of War and The Hands of Peace. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you on our next event.
And thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.